And in this part of the program, we're gonna sort of talk about what we heard in the first hour. And we've gotten a couple of questions already from our students. And we were talking about it behind the scenes before we came out. They're actually tough questions that you all put to us. But I thought they would be a good way to start. So the first question we got was to each of us, which is, what story from your faith tradition means the most to you, and why?
Oh, I guess I will begin. I will be happy to do that. Well, the night before Dr. King was assassinated, he preached in a Pentecostal church, Mason Temple, Church of God in Christ. And he wasn't even supposed to speak that night. He wasn't feeling well. But Ralph Abernathy recounts he shows up and his spirits are up for some reason. And that night he gave his famous I've been to the mountaintop speech. Mm-hmm. And the speech is an allusion to the story of Moses, who was not allowed to go into the promised land. But he was able to look into it and to see that his great work and all his sacrifices are going to pay off for the children of Israel. And I love that story because, in a sense, you can hear in Dr. King's speech that he knew he was going to die. It's incredibly powerful. He knew he was going to die. That by this time on tomorrow, he would be dead. But he had such hope and peace and joy in that moment, and that story means a lot to me because, in a sense, it demonstrates his experience of solidarity with Moses. That, in a sense, the work that he was doing for the black community is very similar. That here's a leader that's not going to be able to benefit from the fruits of his labor, but it is going to be a blessing to his people. And so not only does it show solidarity, but I think it just provides meaning, hope, and strength to stand up in the moment and to say, I'm not afraid, I'm not fearing anyone, for mine eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. And I mean, it's a powerful speech. So that story means a lot to me because when we read stories, we can do so in a way that shows solidarity to those who have gone on before us, and it just provides a window for hope, meaning, and strength for today.
I think that's a wonderful example because, in a way, the interaction between the past and the present, or Dr. King's present, it's sort of interacting, right? I mean, when I read that speech, it also sheds light on Moses to me. I see, the struggle that Moses had with his own self, knowing that he wasn't going to make it into the promised land, and to have Dr. King inhabit that story brings it alive. Yeah.
I'd like to just respond to that before I share mine, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm very moved by that, and I've always been very moved by that Moses isn't buried by the people. The Talmud says that God buries him. We don't know where he's buried even. And in the Passover Seder, the Haggadah, the book we read, we don't talk about him. It's not about him. And it's not about Dr. King. With all my love for Dr. King, my firstborn son, his Hebrew name is Meir Lev Cook, so he has the initials MLK, right? I love the man, but it's not about him, and it's not about Moses, right? And that's what's the power of the story. It's kept alive. The contemporary moral challenges are alive because we don't seal it away into that one person. So I love that parallel between the two, and actually how each of us thinks of ourselves continuing their work. So as I shared earlier, I find the power of stories not in the story itself, but in the tension between stories. Mm-hmm. And I'll give just two snapshots of that. One is the amazing story of Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he doesn't argue with God at all. Now that's incredibly strange because just before that, we learn that God is going to destroy Sodom. And what does Abraham do? He challenges a whole lot. What if there's 50 righteous, 40 righteous, 30 righteous? He's going to challenge God all the way to the end. Can the God of justice is going to do this? right? Such a horrible thing. And so how can right after that story, God say, kill your son? He says, okay. Right? Doesn't even challenge, right? So actually we have to read those two stories in tension with each other. And I'm not going to give the answer on how I do that. But, but okay, fine, I will. So I think Abraham misinterpreted the conclusion that he thinks God wins. Oh, what do I know? God knows everything. I know nothing. If God said this is all wicked people that should be destroyed, I shouldn't have protested. So now you tell me kill my son? Well, you know everything. I don't know anything. I shouldn't protest. But he misinterpreted the conclusion there. And actually, we do have to challenge. We do have to bring voices of protest within our faiths and beyond our faiths. The other story of tension I want to show is between the flood and the Tower of Babel, which is the same parsha, the same container of actually in the Jewish community we just read that together. And after the flood happens because of chaos, there is no order, there is no collectivity. But the end of the flood is the Tower of Babel, which is the opposite problem, not of no collectivity, but radical collectivity. And so what's the sin of the Tower of Babel? One view might be, geez, all of humanity unites and all you can do is build a tower, right? You couldn't build a hospital, you couldn't build a school, right? You couldn't build a festival of faiths for humanity, right? That's all you got is a tower, right? But the other way to read it is, what does it say? All humanity spoke in one voice. One voice. And that is the greatest sin. A unity without diversity. That ultimately we need to figure out, and that's when 70 nations are created, 70 languages, figure out how we can have a unity that deeply embraces the dignity and value of difference within that unity.
Wow. Wonderful.
Yeah. What to say? But I hear a little bit, not enough, wonderful stories from Bible and also the life story of Jesus Christ. Many Buddhists actually hold Jesus Christ in very high regard. And his stories are in very much harmony with the stories of bodhisattvas. It's about love, forgiveness, compassion. Also in Buddhism, we do have love stories. Did I say love stories? Yes, we have love stories, but lots of stories too. But even the story of Buddha is not always same. The Theravadan Buddhists have their own version of a Buddha story, and then Mahayana Buddhists have their own version of a Buddha story, the story of the same Buddha. So which tells us that these stories are needed to have inspiration, moral guideline, and also hold the kind of philosophical system of your own path. But also tells us that we should not get attached to stories. Even in Buddhism, there are almost two conflicting stories about the same Buddha. I think reminding us that yes, we should use those stories, but do not get attached to stories. Because if you get attached to the stories, then there's a danger that we become very dogmatic, and we don't basically listen to the voice of others, their stories. We don't appreciate their stories. We have tendency to demand everybody to believe that my version of stories are the correct, and we try sometimes, unfortunately, force others to adapt my stories. So I think it's good to remember that to use those stories, but not to get too much attached to them, because stories are stories, right? That's why they're called the stories.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Well, but that's what's so instructive about the moment that we find ourselves in. That to go back and use the story of the Tower of Babel, that metaphor, that very much describes what white Americans have done in history, have tried to build this country, with this sort of vision of a monolith that has done such damage, whether it's the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans. And today what you have is voices from the margin trying to be heard so that there is a diversity amongst unity. So this is one of the reasons I'm always honored to be a part of this gathering and this festival, because it's really modeling for the nation how we can live into a healthy future where we can all thrive, where all our stories can be told. And so how do we amplify and magnify platforms to do that is really my passion. And so both of your comments just caught it struck a nerve that very much symbolizes both the history and this moment that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think Rabbi Yanklowitz brought up a fabulous example of how bringing minority voices or marginal voices to the center is actually an ancient tradition. This is not something that we just happened upon, in the last few years. There is something about sacred storytelling that is constantly negotiating with the margins. And in fact, some of our most powerful myths come from the margins. They don't come from the center or those in power. And we can all think of examples of that in our own traditions. I actually have another question before we get to the second audience question, which is sort of implicit in a lot of what you're talking about, which is, can you talk about how sacred stories should be read? I think there's this notion, particularly in the modern West, that you should go to the bookstore, buy yourself a Bible in whatever form, or the Life of the Buddha, and just go home and read it on your own. Can you talk a little bit about the role of community in shaping how we read and what we take from sacred stories?
Rabbi, I'm going to let you begin.
Okay, great. I used to believe, I lived on a hilltop in a caravan in Israel for 2 years, day and night just studying. And I believed at the time, the more I studied, the better of a person I'd be. Like the more scriptures you got into your head, the more you learned. And I started to realize you can learn the wrong way. You can learn in ways that make you a worse person. And that ought to be obvious to us, but I didn't get that. That we have to bring our moral intuition to these stories. And I think part of the ways that we do it in the Jewish community is we learn in chavruta, in study partner. You don't sit alone and read your book. If you walk into a yeshiva, a Jewish learning center, it is set up in pairs. The whole room will be hundreds of people with pairs across from each other, arguing. It's the opposite of a quiet library. It's screaming. People standing up, arguing with each other. You think they're enemies, and then they go get lunch and they're best friends, right? But it happens in that dialectical, engagement, the dialogical, in which Buber moves beyond the text into the face-to-face encounter. And Emmanuel Levinas has a lot to say about this in terms of ethics today. And so I think this notion that these stories have to be engaged in a dialogue fashion rather than in a solitary fashion. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is the humility that in pre-modernity, we sort of thought we had access to objective truth. And then, comes Kant and the like. And we started to realize that all subjective data all objective data passes through the subjectivity of the mind. And then we understood in developmental psychology that we don't hold on to memory. Right? Memory is constantly reconstructed. And so we actually talk more about memory than about stories in the Jewish community. And with a humility that memory is constantly reconstructed and re-understood, and requires a collective of voices to actually get to the heart of what it is we're trying to share. And
I'll add that people have been reading sacred texts for hundreds, thousands of years. So you're not the first person to read and appropriate meaning. And so you read in one point on a long continuum. And it's so important to have some awareness of the ways, emphasis on ways, as in plural, the ways passages and stories have been read, interpreted, and used so that you are making informed and responsible appropriations today. I mean, God forbid we keep repeating some of the mistakes. There are also tremendous gifts from stories and how other traditions and other people have read those in different eras that can be, sources of just such hope and strength and meaning today. And so just to think, hey, I'm going to go grab this book, it's just going to be me by myself. Number one, you can't even read this without a community of people who are willing to compile these things, translate them for you. So you're a part of a gathering, a collection of readers and interpreters.
Thank you, both of you. Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's not like that after this morning we all go out and start purchasing books on stories, sacred stories. We learn stories from conversations, from running into books, from maybe attending talks like this. Today I learned very valuable stories from both of you, and I would contemplate them. Thank you for giving these wonderful sacred stories. But stories, when we read them, we kind of have to know that stories are, of course, usually based on our memories, and our memories are constantly changing, and also the whole narrative is constantly changing as time goes by. So we maybe have to use some kind of discernment to get the moral, the essential wisdom of the story, and not try to take everything literally. And then I think you can enjoy almost any story. Even though I call myself Buddhist, I love to read books from other traditions. Some of my favorite poets are not Buddhist, actually. And Thomas Merton, I loved his books. When I was trying to learn English, one of the first books I picked up was Thomas Merton's books. And I really enjoy reading his books. So I learned lots of stories from not just my own tradition, but from different traditions. And I think if you use discernment, you can always get wisdom from almost every sacred stories, regardless of their tradition.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
The community of readers and interpreters, it's so important because you read from a particular historical, social, and cultural standpoint. And so we often read ourselves into stories and into text. But people who have a different social location can see things in the text that we don't see. So when you are open to listening to the stories of others coming from different locations, they'll actually give you a vantage point or an angle or a truth in a story that you otherwise could not see. So I talk about this in my upcoming book in a chapter called Collateral Damage in the Bible. And I talk about the importance of paying attention to silent characters, people in biblical stories that we completely ignore, like the baby born of the rape of David when he took Uriah's wife Bathsheba, raped her, and the child that was the product of that rape in a form of judgment. God's like, this baby's gonna die. The baby didn't do anything wrong to justify that. And so I talk about how it's important to pay attention to those characters and to explore issues of meaning for these characters and not just the main characters. Why am I even sensitive to that? Well, some of that is because of my social location. I know what it is like to have to suffer in silence. And so listening to interpreters from places beyond where you are will always open your eyes in exciting ways.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that I love to teach, because I get to be with my stories, which are the stories of the Hebrew Bible, and every time there's a student who looks me in the eye and tells me something about this text, this story, that I did not notice. I've assigned it, 25 years running, and I'm hearing about it as if it's new again. And that's what makes sacred stories vibrant, alive, right? That's what gives them new life, is the kind of communal exercise of interpretation. Wonderful. Rinpoche, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, you had a very vivid example, and I'm sure many of us share in it, of your grandparents telling you some of the sacred stories, also some of the ghost stories, but the stories of this world, but also the sacred stories. And I'm wondering if you all could reflect a little bit on how we get our stories, how we receive them from teachers, from ancestors, from grandparents. I'm interested in the personal relay of the sacred stories.
You're up.
You're up. I put you on the spot.
Okay, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah. I think there's many sources of all these sacred stories. I noticed that in Christian and the Jewish sermons, there are a lot of stories. And Buddhism, we tell stories here and there, but it's not like the main part of the lectures or teachings. There's kind of new growing movement in the Buddhist communities where people really like to hear stories, like sacred stories, personal stories, anecdotes, and so forth. But when I listened to stories when I was young, there were many kind of entertainment, and some of them have morals, but then now I actually revisit all the stories again, and they have much more meaning to me. And some of the stories are personal anecdotes, which is more like convincing, and some of them are regarded as maybe fairy tales, and maybe fables, and so forth. But even they're old, I think if you interpret them with the right understanding, they all have so much meaning, and they can be some kind of sacred compass to guide us, because stories are often about being on journey, and life is a journey, and they invite us to be the heroines and heroes on this journey. And sometimes it's not easy to be heroine, right, on this journey, or hero on life is very complicated. So the stories often give us a kind of empowerment or courage to continue this journey. Lots of the stories that I hear from Buddhism is all about being courageous on this journey. And also they always warn you that the journey is going to be tough and difficult. There will be storms and confusions and challenges, tragedies. But if you don't give up, if you continue this journey as a heroine or hero, in the end, you're going to find liberation. Not only that, you'll be a source of goodness to your community, to your family, to the world. So in that sense, I would say all the sacred stories are happy ending or holy ending, something like that. It shows us a destination where we can be great. So maybe we can say, oh, they are holy ending.
Holy ending, I like that. Yeah.
Not so much happy ending.
Yeah.
Well, there's this concept in biblical studies, we call it the canon within the canon. So in the Protestant Bible, there's 66 books, 66 separate writings. And you know, conservative Christians always, all of it's the Word of God. Do you read it all? No, they don't. But it's all the Word of God to them. But what happens in families and churches is there is a focus on certain stories, certain writings that just over time mean a lot. It sort of symbolizes when you look at the whole history of how we come up with the canon of Scripture. Some writings just stand the test of time, and people just keep going back to them. And so growing up in church, there are just certain stories, verses in the Bible that you just keep hearing over and over again. And so when you think about what has been passed down, I just think of this image of my mother sitting on her, always sitting in the living room with her Bible open, reading in the book of Romans. That's probably her favorite book of the Bible, and she's been preaching for over 50 years. And so I grew up with this image of her with the text open, always reading and studying. And so when I think about writings in the Bible that mean a lot to me, a lot of that is being a product of this community of interpreters who says, this verse means a lot to us, this verse gives us meaning, this verse helps us to understand who God is for us. And so I'd just like to share that.
I was so engaged with these great answers, I forgot the question.
So the question is, where do we find our stories? What the sort of the personal dimension of how they're passed on to us, either by grandparents or by mothers or by the selection of certain stories within the canon?
So, wow. So I grew up in an interfaith home. My father is Jewish, and my mother is an evangelical Christian.
So you've got a story.
And like every dinner table was a festival of faith. You know? Anybody could come. You're all welcome to the table. And you know, like religion divides in society, so too religion divided. And when I chose at 10 to pursue the Jewish path, you know, there was hurt involved in that. I mean, they gave me the choice of access to both. But it turns out now, decades later from that choice, my mother and I are study partners. And she, as someone who has stage 4 cancer and is a very, very frail, and brings a deeply religious Christian read to the text, we read the book of Psalms together. And what emerges from that is not Christian-Jewish dialogue. What emerges for that is deeply vulnerable, deeply human, deeply spiritual reads of text between a mother and a son. And I couldn't, as a child, hear her, what she wanted to offer me, for various reasons why kids can't hear their parents. Because, you know, a religious teaching sounds the same as go clean your room. And so we want to push back against these things. But now I can hear her so deeply. I can hear her so deeply, and I very much cherish that gift. And I document, I write down, you know, everything she shares in our sessions together. And I think that sometimes we think about community, but sometimes some of those relationships that are most important to us, having hard conversations can be achieved through looking at stories rather than looking just at those conversations and allowing those conversations to emerge from those stories.
That's beautiful, wonderful. So Rinpoche, you said something that really landed with me. You said that stories have the power to make us like ourselves. Maybe our better selves, maybe not, but like ourselves. And I wonder, I would love to hear about that from each of your perspective. How is it that sacred stories make us like ourselves?
What way do we mean like there?
Oh,
Do you mean like I like me? Like
no,
I look in the mirror
no,
and I like me?
no, I don't mean it that way. I mean, they make us into ourselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good, thank you for that's a good clarification. And I wonder, I would love to hear more about that from you, Rinpoche, but I'd also love to hear from our other panelists if that resonates, if that lands the way that it did for me. Do you want to start us off, since it was your brilliance?
Okay, you invite me to be the first, okay? Yeah, the today I'm sitting here, and we have a role, doctor, rabbi, right? And my role is perhaps the Tibetan word would be lama. I do have a very funny story about that, but maybe another time. So you could say my role is lama. Why I end up being lama, whatever that means in this life, it has to do with the stories. Of course, I will be a Buddhist since I'm a Tibetan person. Most Tibetan people are Buddhist. But I may not be sitting here playing this role as Lama. I could be anywhere. I could be in Tibet right now, maybe being a yak herder, most probably, herding yaks in the mountains. It's a very nice lifestyle. I become Lama mainly while growing up with my grandparents. They told me lots of stories. They're very simple-minded people. They're not really literate. My grandfather read a little bit, not so much. They're Buddhist, very much devout Buddhist, but they did two things: chanting Buddhist prayers and telling Buddhist stories. No doctrine, no Buddhist doctrine, because they're not educated. You kind of have to be a little bit educated to know all these Buddhist doctrines. So they never really told me any Buddhist doctrines. I had to learn the Buddhist doctrines much later through some kind of formal training. But they always chanted prayers every day, and they will be turning the prayer wheel and holding the mala, chanting, especially Nemo Bhava Loktashvara, Om Mani Padme Hum all the time. And they told me lots of Buddhist stories, which inspired me to not just become Buddhist, but to take the path as my life's vocation. So, which led me to dedicate my life to this path, and that's why I'm here. So, in that sense, these stories actually changed my life and gave me a whole, path. So they are very powerful in that sense.
That's fascinating, that the power of sacred story to shape the self in a way that doctrine doesn't.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Do you,
Well, there's the story of me and there's the story of we, and it's interesting. If we're all going to die, right? I hope I didn't just break some news to everyone, but we're all going to die, and for most of us, that actually adds more meaning to our lives rather than less. The fact that we're mortal. But if I told you that in 30 years from our death, all of humanity was going to die, that would actually, I think, for most of us, remove all meaning from our lives. Like, what is this about? And we sometimes think of ourselves as individualistic and selfish, but I think actually we are very collectivist in our nature. The fact that we're going to die, we're okay with. The fact that all humanity is not going to make it, we might, like we can't bear. We understand that the stories outlive us. And so how does my story exist inside a larger context of stories? And when I tell stories to my kids or in an educational context, I say, that's the mashal, that's the story. Now, what's the nimshal? What do you take from the story? Like, what are you going to live with there? And I think one of the things that took me a long time to realize was that some of our stories have overtaken our minds, stories about ourselves, that we have been told we're something throughout our lives. We're less valuable. We matter less. Or we are defined by that moment of a bad choice we made in our lives at some point, right? And we have a story about who we are. And ultimately, learning how to hold some stories more loosely in order to create more space for other stories as well. That's not only true on a global interfaith context, it's not only true on a human level of current and the future of humanity, but it's true of the self as well, that I am many things. And there's no story of my life that can ultimately define me.
There's a text out of James in the first chapter where it gives the exhortation to be hearers and doers of the word. As the passage goes on, it uses the analogy of hearing scripture in a way as similar to looking at your image in a mirror or in a glass. Stories provide powerful mirrors about humanity. Now, with two caveats. First, if we stop always putting ourselves in the hero-heroine spot and start maybe seeing ourselves as some of the, the people who aren't doing good things in these stories, and understanding that all texts are not prescriptive, some of them are just descriptive. I talk about this in my book about how there is a dark side to religion. And religious people have the capacity for such good, but also the capacity for indifference, hate, and evil, and to use God to justify those things. And so there are texts that seem problematic that are actually very, very instructive about our capacity to do those things to our neighbors. And so I love using stories and text as a mirror that gives us an opportunity to be honest about ourselves and to encourage us to be the best of ourselves and not the worst.
I love that. If I can just add one thing to
Please,
that.
Yes.
This idea of owning our shadow side, the shadow side of religion and the shadow side of ourselves and our own complicity. Yeah. That the famous verse in Leviticus, you shall love your fellow as yourself, is in Hebrew, ve'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha, you shall love your fellow. But actually, reyecha, which sounds like your fellow, can also be translated as from ra, which means evil. You shall love reyecha, your evil, as part of yourself, which is another way of interpreting, you have to, if you only see yourself or your religion as light, and you don't see the shadow side of that history and of our own complicity, and own that and love it as part of the full self, in the sense that I take responsibility for it, then we may have missed what the whole enterprise is.
That's tight, Doc. Yes. Yeah.
So in an interesting way, that actually leads into the second audience question that we got, which was to you, from our students, to you, are sacred stories religious texts or personal narratives or both, and why?
Ooh-wee.
I know, I told you they ask hard questions. Are sacred stories religious texts or personal narratives or both, and why?
I'll be quick. I think in a way they could be both. I don't think that sacred stories, they can be sacred but not authoritative in the same way as a sacred text. But they do influence how we read the text. So it's kind of a both and. That is a great, great question, because we cannot read texts devoid of who we are and all that we bring to the text. So being aware of that and what's sacred about aspects of our experience and how they inform how we read text, it's all in that messy hermeneutical mush. So I would say yes to both of those questions.
I agree with you. Yeah, they can be both. I don't think I also answered your question completely. Yeah, the spiritual stories in Buddhism are sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical. It's not like that we are trying to interpret them metaphorically. Actually, Buddhism already gave us a kind of authority to do that. Lots of sutras will say such stories, and then later the ancient commentators on the sutras will say this is not to be taken literally. But I think the heart of all the spiritual stories or sacred stories in Buddhism is about truly actualizing who we are. Even though there are narratives, their language, their whatever rhythm are very different, but they all are pointing out to the same place. You can have many compass, but they're all pointing to the same place. And that lies within. Buddhism teaches that the most thing that we are worshipping, we may use that word, or that we are praying to, is called Dharmakaya, which is ineffable Buddha, unborn Buddha. And they always say, do not seek that unborn Buddha outside yourself, because that would be just the journey of confusion. But come back to yourself, and you'll find the ultimate truth, the absolute, the unborn Buddha within yourself. Your true nature is the unborn Buddha. So therefore, I feel that all the sacred stories in Buddhism actually are eventually teaching you how to become who you are, how to be awakened, or how to actualize your true nature. And that is already the unborn Buddha. In that sense, they all lead to the same place, and that place lies within each of us.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So I wonder how both of those types of stories can be windows to expansiveness. And to start with, how our sacred stories can expand us beyond our personal biases. So take the death penalty. I happen to be myself opposed to the death penalty because of racial injustices and racial biases, and the high percentages of people who are innocently killed and put on death row. But take that case. If one's child was the murderer, they are likely to oppose the death penalty. And if one's child was, God forbid, the one who was killed, they're more likely to support it. But if we approach that issue of the death penalty through our sacred stories first and formulate our values without the personal biases of the emotional intensity of those traumas, we can transcend our personal stories and our personal biases to reach a place of justice, a place of collective ethics. And so those stories can be expansive beyond us. Now take the opposite, how our personal stories can be more expansive than a more narrow sacred story we've inherited. We all have people in our communities and stories that of supremacy, of Christian supremacy. This is the one true faith, everything else is lies. Jewish supremacy, everything else is lies. And relationships in our personal lives can help us to expand and challenge those notions. As I mentioned with my mother, like that learning with my mother is something that empowers me to push back at anything I hear in a Jewish space that makes it sound like, oh, any other faith, it's really missed the mark. This is really the one that's got it right. I go, no. I know my mother. This is not just a personal love. That love and that dignity actually enables me to expand and challenge some of those sacred stories. So I think that the relationship between those two can both push us in different areas of expansiveness.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a question in which I ask you to forecast. So, as you all know, the tradition of finding sacred stories in a book between two covers is actually fairly recent in human history, right? It's been oral for all of its all of their existence, and there have been different media by which stories have been relayed, scrolls, so on and so forth. Where are we going to be finding our sacred stories in the years to come? What media? How are they going to be transmitted and relayed to a wider culture? We've talked about the importance of the personal, of grandparents. We've talked about the importance of the book. But what are the other forms in which we remake and retell our sacred stories for future audiences?
Welcome to one of my university favorite classes, where one of my favorite places to study religion and philosophy is TV and movies, film. We tell stories, and this is such a big part of our culture that really the Religious Academy is a little slow responding to. I think we will continue to tell stories about ourselves and the deep anxieties we have about the future in movies. So whether it's the zombie genre, that we're experimenting with things and we're going to unleash things on ourselves, I think it's important to pay attention to the stories that's coming out of the entertainment industry, because they are beyond just entertaining us. They're communicating some deeper things, and I think that's going to be something that's going to continue for quite some time. And I want to forecast that a future Festival of Faiths is going to be examining the role of religion in film and media down the road. So just since we're forecasting.
Well, I feel that part of the negative dimension of capitalism and of our current moment is how we allow the loudest voices to shape our collective story. Elon Musk cannot be our storyteller. And sometimes the social media feeds in these little snapshots where there can be a lot of truth, but they dominate our discourse and they dominate our sense of identity and the story of what's actually happening, those who have the bigger platforms. I want to push us to think about how we hear the still small voice in very humble, vulnerable spaces. How we listen to some of the most marginalized and those who are suffering most, and hear their stories in our own lives and allow them to shape us as well. I know I have a Japanese friend, he's about 75 years old, and he just goes hospice to hospice, holding the hands of the dying. And he has no social media platforms, he has no books, he has nowhere to tell his stories. But those are the stories he hears, the last words on people's lips. And I want those stories to shape us as well. It says in the Talmud, where will the Mashiach be found? Where will the Messiah be found? At the city gates, sitting among the sick and the homeless, wrapping bandages. And I think that the kinds of stories that I want to see us cultivate are from those spaces.
You get the last word.
Maybe no word, the last word. Yeah, I don't really have anything to say more than you both said it perfectly. Yeah, you're right. The social media is a very powerful medium, and if you tell story, it can reach out to so many people in instant, not just within your community, but to the other side of the world. So therefore, I feel that in some sense, we all have our own little platform, as long as we have a smartphone, which everybody does. So we all can be storytellers. The question is, what kind of a storyteller you want to be? You want to tell a story that would incite division, prejudice, cruelty, competition, greed, or you want to tell stories that invoke more a noble impulse in the people, an impulse like social activism, and our duty to, work for justice and peace, harmony, and saving the environment. So we are all storytellers. I think everybody has a following these days, right, in social media. So there are a lot of people who are listening to your stories, and therefore remember to be a sacred storyteller.
Very nice.
Wonderful. Thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists.